Welcome to another Headless Professor video. This one is on presumption and the burden of proof. Presumption is an initial assumption that we make that something is good or true. In the absence of sufficient evidence, meeting a burden of proof, presumption is going to prevail. So if we have a debate and one side has presumption and the other side does not meet a burden of proof to substantiate its position, the side with presumption wins. So which side enjoys presumption? Well, in courts of law, according to the U.S. system at least, the defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty. In a debate about policy where we have an affirmative side advocating a change and a negative side defending the present system, presumption goes to the negative, which defends the status quo. In science, presumption rests with the null hypothesis, the assumption that there is no causal relationship between two variables. The burden of proof is what must be shouldered by the side that does not have presumption. That side must prove its case with sufficient evidence in order to overcome the presumption enjoyed by the other side. This leads us to the frequently used rhetorical device known as the appeal to ignorance. This means that we simply have to claim that our position has not been proved to the contrary. A prima facie case is a series of initially presented arguments that would be minimally sufficient in terms of its evidence and reasoning to meet a burden of proof and overcome the presumption enjoyed by the other side. If a prima facie case is not met in a court of law, the defense might move for the dismissal of the case without having to present any arguments in substantiation for the innocence of the defendant. So, how do we determine who exactly has the burden of proof? In reality, it's going to be the audience that determines the burden of proof, because the audience comes with assumptions, a presumption on the side of one or the other. So the burden of proof is going to be shouldered by the other side, such as the prosecution in a criminal trial, or the affirmative team in a debate of policy, or scientists who are trying to confirm a new hypothesis about a relationship between two variables. Now, it's very difficult to figure out exactly who has the burden of proof on ethical issues. Some philosophers maintain that presumption lies with freedom, and in absence of evidence to the contrary, something which is ethically questionable should be permitted. Other philosophers would say that presumption lies with prudence, and in the absence of justification for a given action, we should err on the side of caution and prohibit it. What is very unclear is who has the burden of proof in topics dealing with definitions. values or theology. Agnostics, for example, assume that presumption lies with doubt. For example, they might say there is no proof that the Bible is true. Of course, many theists will start with the opposite presumption and say, well, there's no proof that the Bible isn't true. Agnostics are assuming that presumption lies with doubt, and I'm not so sure that it does. My verdict is that in questions of definition or values or theology, perhaps presumption should lie with tradition. So who has the burden of proof in these areas of definitions, values, and theology? I would say that perhaps we're asking the wrong question, and maybe these kinds of issues should be handled by a dialogue, a discussion, rather than debate. Perhaps we need a dialogue. Instead of debating the definition of a word, perhaps we need a discussion coming to some mutual agreement about what words mean and how we should use them. When it comes to values, instead of debating them, again, I'm suggesting that we have a discussion and talk about which values are most important and why. And I would say the same thing is true about religious issues. Instead of a debate, perhaps we need to have a dialogue about what is the best way to worship on our communal spiritual journey. This has been another Headless Professor video on presumption and the burden of proof.